know what, if we switch it slightly, and I'm not sure how much you do in the cyber crime space, but particularly during COVID, but even prior to COVID, we saw what a lot of people speculate is an increase in activity by nation state actors engaged in cybercrime. And yeah, and the kind of the prototypical, I guess, or archetype of this is like North Korea. I mean, this is like the typical example that people like to use, I think, in the media and whatnot. But from your own perspective, how have nation states perpetrating cyber crimes, as well as how nation states who are trying to prevent that?
I think part of that, a large part of that question and answer gets to the point about attribution. But the the subject of attribution is such a controversial one, and you
Hmm.
may be aware of this in circles on cyber. And there are different standards, right, that you can apply to accountability and attribution. There are technical standards, and so you can have a technical level of attribution, which, as I understand, is getting easier and easier. There are some authorities that can pinpoint the exact person conducting the exact operation at that particular time through, other forms of intelligence, I guess. But then you also have a legal standard of attribution. And there is discussion about whether you should apply standards in criminal law or standards in civil law. Who does the burden of proof fall on? And what are the other standards that are associated with attributing in the legal dimension? And then finally, I think the most contentious of all is the level of political attribution, whether states decide to name and shame, as it were, some of these nation states that are purportedly conducting these operations. And you've seen examples of that with countries like Australia, the UK, and the US banding together to name and shame Russia or North Korea for certain operations. I doubt very much that you'll see that same willingness by countries in Southeast Asia or even other parts of Asia, maybe China accepted, where countries are willing to say forcefully and conclusively that, yes, we found this country to be behind these attacks, and we'd like for there to be accountability and justice to be served. It's a very dicey situation because obviously there are political considerations to take into account, international relations to be preserved. And so this idea of how you hold a country responsible or not for a certain operation is still going to be a really sticky question for the foreseeable future.
If we go to AI and this idea of strategic competition, one area of discussion was this idea of strategic competition in certain crucial technologies like artificial intelligence between China and the United States. And and you can go online and find all these very like kind of ominous quotes about artificial intelligence and who controls it and what that's going to imply for the future of the world and all these things. Without getting too melodramatic, is that indeed a struggle that I guess you're seeing from the public policy side of things, or is that a little bit more of hyperbole that we kind of see in popular press?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of both, right? So definitely there's a lot of drama in reporting on AI when it comes to strategic competition among the major powers. But the discussion is so different in other parts of the world, particularly in Asia and Africa and Latin America. And that's most of
Mm,
the world, really,
mm,
where the question of AI and what it brings to development, what it brings to the population, these discussions are had in much more developmental terms. And so I think part of the disconnect is when you have power centers, whether they're economic or technological, in the global north that are exporting a lot of these models to the global south, does that entrench existing power imbalances in the world? And what does it mean for most of the population that lives outside the US or China or Europe? If you look at UN population trends, you'll see that most of the world by 2050, by the 2100, they're going to be situated in Africa and Asia.
mhm,
And yet the technology power centers remain in Silicon Valley or, Shenzhen or
mm.
wherever, just not in places like Indonesia, like parts of Africa, where the population growth is really going to explode over the next few decades. And so there is this underpinning question about notions of social justice, about what is right and what should be right, more philosophical, but I think nonetheless really, really important questions that we haven't really unpacked yet in parts of the global south, because we're so keen on embracing all aspects of technology, including AI, for the sole purpose of progressing, advancing our economies, that we haven't really had the time to consider some of these weightier issues, things like bias and discrimination that are now being considered in the US, but that these discussions haven't caught up in places like Southeast Asia, where I would argue the impacts of which could be as grave, if not more, in these countries.
I'm really glad you mentioned that because that's certainly something we discuss in the course as well. This idea that the nature of artificial intelligence in particular is such that if we don't have those discussions in parallel to how the technology is developing, then what we end up having, it may be too late to roll back. That is, I think, a very real threat. And taking it out of the idea of global politics, just like in general, in terms of our collective humanity of like how do we want to shape this future? One discussion we sometimes have is if we could rewind to the kind of proliferation of the internet, how would we view it differently, knowing what we know now, right? And I think to your point, I think artificial intelligence is that same kind of counterfactual, like what if type of question, except just amplified by the significance of it.
And we operate in the same frameworks and within the same parameters that we've always known. But the reality is that we've included, or rather excluded, so many different knowledge systems and worldviews in this construction of the internet as we know it, that I think it's worth just pausing and reflecting on all those different knowledge systems that could enrich actually what a different digital future might look like. So I have a podcast talking about tech in the global south, and one of the guests I had is Maori from New Zealand,
Mm-hmm.
Aotearoa, New Zealand, and she talked about the social injustices in real life that are entrenched now in the technological space because they haven't been redressed in real life. And so I think that, and the fact that there are indigenous communities around the world who see notions of data and intellectual property in very different ways than we operate now. The idea that no one owns knowledge, the idea of relation, this relational aspect of everything. We all relate to each other, we relate to the earth, to nature. And so no one really, we're just custodians, we don't own anything. This framework hasn't really been taken into account as we craft our digital futures. And so I wonder whether we're missing out on opportunities that we haven't even begun to consider, as the world crashes around us.
Mm-hmm. That paradigm is quite interesting. I think part of that is because of the way we fund uh, technology companies. Um, it's very difficult to account for different paradigms. So if we even look at how like capital markets have evolved globally from the West to to Asia to Africa to other global markets and using kind of similar patterns of ownership, capital raising, and you just using those same precedents as we move forward, which is probably what we've done
Mhm.
in the context of what you're talking about. And I was just listening to a panel earlier today of actually people in fintech in Southeast Asia. And oftentimes you hear a similar refrain about we want to democratize finance for particularly for people who are unbanked or underbanked. And it's always interesting to me because that is a great aspiration. But sometimes I wonder, does that process of financialization in a society and the potential inequality that it will ultimately breed, does that actually solidify, the cleavages that already existed, or does it create new cleavages?
That's a great point. I mean, on the one hand, there's this good intention of trying to serve the underserved. But at the same time, when you think about it, when you work your way through the processes, well, okay, how is that going to happen? We need data on all these people who are underbanked and underserved. How is that data going to be collected if these people are inadequately represented in, say, national census surveys, for example? Do they consent to having their data being collected and for what purpose, right? Then you get into this whole well, is a risk-based approach appropriate? Should data only be used for legitimate purposes? And so these are, kind of high polluting debates that we have at the policy level. But what does it really mean to that person on the ground who may or may not be interested in being served or being banked, but would nevertheless have to access these services in order to conduct their daily lives, right?
So this has been a super fascinating discussion of all the things that you're looking at, the different projects that you're working on, and the different initiatives that you are researching as it relates to this intersection of technology and public policy. Is there anything that you're working on or see potentially coming along that really excites you about prospects for the future?
To me, I'm really heartened by some of the emerging innovations in the policy space as it relates to tech. So
Mm,
I've listened and been a part of some really fascinating conversations about rethinking tech outside of the paradigms that we're comfortable with. For example, there are African scholars who are talking about applying the concept of Ubuntu, again, this relational aspect of the world, but also in tech, and what it means when you apply it to cyberspace or online interactions, for example. What does it mean for accountability when everybody is in relation to each other and everybody owes each other a sense of responsibility and
mm,
accountability? And these are the types of questions I think that need to be unpacked a lot more, particularly by those of us outside the West, who come from outside the West, but also live in the West, like myself. And it's that reclaiming and reasserting of agency and, in a small measure, authority over how we engage in the online space. And it's the idea that we don't necessarily need to buy into existing norms, although we do because they're good and they serve us, but that we also can help innovate that space based on our historical context, our lived experiences, and the knowledge systems that have been left out of existing frameworks. And so I think that reawakening of consciousness is particularly exciting. It's just bubbling under the surface, but I hope to see more of that because, to be honest, the current framework is a little bit staid and starting to get a little tiring and tired. And so I think the injection of these different ideas, not necessarily new at all, will help enrich a much more equitable digital future, hopefully for the rest of us.
Well, that's absolutely fascinating, and I think ultimately what I take away from that is being willing to hear voices that we've historically marginalized them, and as we think about technological advancement and development and the new norms, if we go back to what we were talking about at the very beginning, that emerge should include those voices um, to be fully representative.
Right. I mean, we talk
Yeah.
about diversity, equity, and inclusion a lot here in the United States, as you know. But to bake that in, I think, as you alluded to earlier, into the design process, into the conceptualization process of some of these technological innovations is going to be key.
Yeah. Well, Leah, I'm so thankful that you were able to carve away. I know of your busy schedule. I know you got working on lots of interesting projects, but we're so thankful that you're able to join us and our students and talk about these really important issues that I think in so many ways will shape the future of what we're going to live through, but what lots of people in the world will be impacted by. And so thank you again for making time and a great excuse to reconnect.
Thank you so much, David, for this opportunity.